Hello, and welcome to the CreativeStudio 2.0 demonstration. I'm Matt Sherman, Chief Software Development Engineer for Statler Stitcher, and I'll be walking you through our exciting new features. It has been Gamel's long-term goal with CreativeStudio to add drawing functions into the program. We did this to make pattern editing easier and to help the quilter be even more creative. Now you're able to take things like this pantograph and make it into point-to-point. We first are going to go through the menu item changes. The first menu item is the View Crosshair. This shows you the current position of the head. I'm now going to move the head like this. It shows a large crosshair across the screen, and it reports to you the current needle position of the stitcher. This is useful for checking pattern position, block size, the edges of your quilt, and the position of the take-up roller in an edge-to-edge. To turn off the crosshair, just go back into the View menu, and you'll notice it's checked when the crosshair is visible. Uncheck this, and the crosshair will go away. I'll leave the crosshair off so you can see better. We have a new menu item called Draw. Under Draw is a new item called Pattern Anchor. And here I have Edge Pattern Anchor selected. And when you pick the pattern, you'll see handles very familiar to what you're used to. We have made the handles translucent. We've also made the cursor disappear as you're resizing so that you can see through the handles. So this is a little bit nicer. But this is the Edge Pattern Anchor, and this is the type of pattern anchor that you've been used to in CreativeStudio since the very beginning. The Edge Pattern Anchor is termed that because it maintains the edge of a pattern. Always maintains the opposite edge. When you pick the corner, it maintains the opposite corner, or two edges. Our next pattern anchor under the Draw menu is the Center Pattern Anchor. It will maintain the center of a pattern like this. This is very useful for globally increasing or decreasing the margin of a pattern. You can still move a pattern and rotate a pattern. The next pattern anchor is the Endpoint Pattern Anchor. Now if you switch to Endpoint Pattern Anchor with a pattern like this selected, it won't actually change. It'll go to the default of Edge. But if you pick a pattern that actually has endpoints and then go into the Pattern Anchor Endpoint, you'll see two pattern anchors at the start and end of the pattern. And you can move the pattern around with either of these anchors. The Endpoint Pattern Anchor will maintain the aspect of the pattern as you move it. To change the pattern anchor type quickly, you can double-click a selected pattern, and you will cycle through the Edge Pattern Anchor, the Center Pattern Anchor, and the Endpoint Pattern Anchor, and then back to Edge. The other method for selecting the pattern anchor is to press the F9 key for the Edge Pattern Anchor, the F10 for the Center Pattern Anchor, and the F11 for the Endpoint Pattern Anchor. Our next draw item is the Set Sew Order. The hotkey for that is F8. When you select that, it will show the order that these patterns are going to sew in. This is the second pattern that will sew. Just past the start of the pattern is a little box with a number in it, and that's the order, the sewing order. And at the end of that pattern is an arrow that's color coordinated to match. So in this situation, this middle pattern will sew first, and then it'll jump up and do this apple core. Then it'll jump down and do the beginning of the border, the end of the border, and then the other apple core. This is of course not desirable. So what we will do is we will click the sew order box of the pattern we want to sew first. In this case, I want this pattern to sew first. You notice the box will turn blue and the arrow will turn blue. You then click the next pattern and notice that it now says 1, and so on, like that. And this is the new sewing order: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you're ready to commit, you press F8 to commit. If you want to check, you can just press F8 to check. If, when you're setting your sewing order, you realize, oops, I made a mistake, you can just press Escape. And now the sewing order has not been changed. Now that we have these patterns ordered properly, it sure would be nice to be able to hook them up. The Endpoint Pattern Anchor is the tool we want to have to do this, and now with it being translucent, you can get it pretty close. But it sure would be nice if we could just snap it to this endpoint. That's where the endpoint snap comes into play. You can come down here and click the E box, and now the endpoint snap is active. You can also click E on your keyboard to deactivate and to activate endpoint snap. Now all I have to do is just move this pattern slightly and it'll snap into place. And I'll come over here and move that one. I'm going below my border here, so I'm going to switch to my edge anchor and pull this one up. I'm going to double click this pattern back around to endpoint and snap it like that. And just like that, I have a properly ordered continuous sewing border. And while we're introducing this endpoint snap function, we should also talk about this G. G stands for grid point snap. So I'm going to come over here and turn on the grid. Set my grid size 5 inches, and I'm going to display the grid. And then I'm going to move this pattern around. And notice G is not pressed. While you're dynamically moving a pattern, you can press G or E. You don't have to let go. So I'm going to press G, and you'll see that the pattern will snap to the grid. This is a good point to introduce a rule that's true for endpoint snap and grid point snap. The snap will move to the closest point. So once I cross the middle point, it'll snap to the grid, the corresponding grid. When I go down, same thing. So you can fix this pattern that's now off its border just lickety-split by just pressing E, which will automatically deactivate the G and activate the E snap. And now we've snapped to this endpoint. On this one, you'll get some strange behaviors if you have endpoint snap active because it's trying to find the closest snap. The reason it's snapping down here is because there was a point down there earlier. So the reason you want, or what you want to do, is just turn off endpoint snap. So just press E, and then you can just dynamically move this pattern around. Credit for the snap goes to my lovely wife Angela. That's her snapping her fingers as the pattern snaps into place. We have always had the ability to draw boundaries with the head for placing patterns like these. But now you can draw a boundary with the mouse on the CAD screen. To do that, go into the Draw menu, come down to the Draw Boundary function, and click that. You'll notice with all the draw functions that the word draw a boundary comes up, and a basic description of what to do in the bottom left. Draw a boundary on the CAD. CAD stands for Computer-Aided Drafting, which is our draw screen here with the grid. And you'll also notice that the cursor changes into a crosshair. The menu items all gray out. So to start drawing, you just start left-clicking the corners of your boundary. And you can enter as many as you want. When you're satisfied, right-click to close. And you'll stay in the boundary mode where you can start doing your next one. To get out of the boundary mode in all of the draw functions, just press Escape. To prove to you that this is a boundary, I will now do Pattern to Boundary. I'm now going to start drawing a boundary again. All of the draw tools have a shortcut. In this case, the draw boundary is Alt plus B. I'm not going to use the menu item to enter the draw mode. I'm going to use the keyboard this time. I'm pressing and holding the Alt key. While holding the Alt key, I'm pressing the B key. And you can start drawing a boundary. Now, drawing a boundary freehand is maybe useful if you've already created some boundaries from the head and you're trying to fill in spaces on the CAD screen. But if you wanted to design a whole cloth from the beginning on the CAD, you would need some method of controlling and sizing your clicks more accurately. To do that, just press the G to activate Grid Point Snap. And now you're snapping your boundary to the grid. When you're done, just right-click to close. Another way to exit the draw features is to come up to the draw menu and to decheck the draw item. And another way is to press the hotkey for that function. In this case, Alt plus B. One of our most requested features was the ability to draw a trim from the CAD screen. Here I have a pattern that I want to trim away this flower, but I haven't sewn this pattern yet, so I'm not really sure where the flower is going to be. Plus I have something on the quilt in this area that I want to keep. So to trim this flower away, I'm going to use the Draw Trim. I'm going to click Draw Trim. Alt plus T also will activate this function. And I'm going to start trimming around this flower. And I can be just as careful as I want to be. And I'll keep clicking until I've completely surrounded this flower. And then right-click to close. Here I have an applique or a photograph on my quilt that I want to avoid. I want to fill the area around it with a meander. It sure would be nice if I didn't have to sew these little loops and have all the extra ties. In order to cover this, I'm going to activate the Draw Trim feature. I'm going to do it this time from the keyboard. I'm pressing and holding Alt, and then I'm pressing T. And notice at the top it says Draw Trim, and my cursor changes to a crosshair. And I just start clicking around the loops that I want to cover. It's okay if the trims cross each other. And then once you've covered your area, you just right click to close. You can press Escape to get out of the Draw Trim feature, or you can press Alt plus T. In past versions, it would take a long time for CreativeStudio to process a pattern that had a trim on it. We've improved that many times to the point where there's almost no difference between when you press Quilt or Restart with a pattern that's covered by a trim or a pattern that's not. To show you that, I'm going to go ahead and press Quilt on this now. And just like that, it's already moving into position. And there it's taking my stitch. And there it's sewing. That sound is the new thread break alarm. So you might listen for that. It's a little bit more informative of the previous beep. That's probably a good time to mention that there's all kinds of new sounds inside CreativeStudio, and we plan on adding even more sounds. We tried to make our sounds informative and to help you so that you could notice them and be more productive. In the past, we could only draw sewable geometry by using the point-to-point line or the point-to-point pattern. If for designing things from the CAD, we felt it would be really nice to be able to do that from here. So here's the point-to-point line and the point-to-point pattern. I'll show you those first because that's what you're familiar with. Here I'm going to click point-to-point line. And I am going to change my grid size to a smaller size, 1 inch. And then I'm going to see if I can fill in this area with a crosshatch. To do that, you can freehand a point-to-point line, but in this case I want it to grid point snap. So I'm going to press G on the keyboard, and it snaps to the grid. And just start clicking around. Oh, there we go. Here I'm about to finish my crosshatch, and then you just right click to complete. And this is a pattern. It has all of the attributes of a pattern. It's resizable. It has a width and a size and rotation. The next Draw Sewable item is Draw Sewable Point-to-Point Pattern. This will allow you to draw with a point-to-point pattern, just like we did with the line. So I'm going to select that. I've got my grid point snap on. And I'm going to make a little frame around our crosshatch. And I'm just left clicking for each pattern, just like I did with point-to-point line. I'm left clicking along, making the middle ones a little wider. And then when you're done, you just hit the right-click key on your mouse. And then you can just press Escape or Alt-P to exit. The last two Draw Sewable features are the arc and the curve. The arc is a 3-point curve. You can use it with grid point snap on. You can also, I'm going to turn grid point snap off by pressing G on the keyboard. You can also freehand it. It's dynamic. It shows you. You can zoom in if you want as you're moving it. You can get the effect you want. You can also turn on endpoint snap with any of these drawable tools, which I'm going to do now. And here I'm going to endpoint snap to this pattern. I'm going to press E again because I want to have a point out here. And I want to be free to do that. Then I'm going to press E again to activate endpoint snap. And there, I've snapped to that. If I want that to be continuous, I would just press Escape. And then I would press F8 and set my sew order 0, 1, 2. You can ignore the rest of the patterns. They'll maintain the order they were in. These will be the first 3 to sew. And then you can just press F8 again. If you want, you can combine that into one pattern. Probably a good time to bring up another new feature is this next. That tells you the next pattern to sew. We put that in at the same time we put in the set sew order because when you're sewing along, you can kind of gives you a clue as to if, hey, wait a minute, that word next jumped over 20 inches. I'm going to press stop at the next bob and pull up and change that. And now for the curve, the draw a sewable curve. I'm going to turn off my endpoint snap. And what it'll do is it'll go through every point that I click. And right here I'm freehanding a curve in. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the grid point snap so you can see that no matter where I click, it will go through those points. It'll change the geometry of the previous section so that it'll go through that intersection. Keep in mind that everything on this screen, other than the borders, is sewed and will be able to be sewed. The other new menu item is contained under Tools, Technical Support, Controller Definition, and we have Stop at Jump Stitch. If that is checked and tie-offs are off, you can do a hand tie. And that includes on spots where designers have done no-sews, between letters on a pattern. If you turn tie-offs on, it'll still stop. It'll do tie-off and it'll still stop. And then you could clip your threads so you're not dragging thread. Okay, on to our right-click changes. To activate the right-click menu, just right-click a pattern. Our first change is to the rotate 90 degrees. It used to rotate a pattern by 90 degrees. Now you'll see it stays active. That's one change. The other change is that the value of the rotation is settable. And it changes the display, rotate by 5 degrees. And it stays active. Right-click this next pattern. I'm going to move it by 5 degrees and this one by 5 degrees. The next right-click change is to our circular array. I'm going to right-click this pattern. I'm going to go into circular array. It looks pretty much the same other than there's these two little buttons. And what these buttons will do for you is I want there to be 13 of these feather leaves. And then I'm going to click either the text number of copies or this button right here. And it'll automatically calculate the number of degrees that's needed to make 13 copies. And it'll reduce the number of copies by 1 to compensate for the pattern that's already on the CAD screen. So then all you have to do is place array center point. And there's also the ability to grid point snap. And I'm going to turn that off for this. I'm going to eyeball it below the center of the pattern, and I'm going to click. Okay. Other than the math, this is pretty much what you would have with the previous version. This will not sew continuously because of the jumps. But if I double-click this pattern until I get to the endpoint pattern anchor, and then I turn on endpoint snap, I can now drag the end of each pattern around to where it's touching the previous pattern. Or sorry, the next pattern. I can continue doing that, being careful to always keep moving around the circle in the same direction, not skipping any pattern. And what I'm achieving is a wreath that'll sew continuously. The other auto-calculate for circular array is where you know your degrees. Say I want 25 degrees. It's probably not as common. You usually just know your number of copies. But I'm going to click Add Degrees, and it figures out that I need 13 copies. I'm going to place the array point, and it makes a circle also. The next feature that I want to demo for you is when you right-click and then you pick Divide Pattern. What we'd use this for is if we wanted to make a point-to-point pattern out of this pano that just contained one butterfly. When you pick Divide Pattern, it shows all the places that the arcs and lines of the original pattern. And whenever the cursor moves over one of these node points where two arcs meet, the cursor turns to a crosshair. When you left-click down, the pattern divides at this point. You can divide again. Just right-click, hit Divide. The nodes are translucent. Where two nodes are, they will be darker. When you click, it'll pick the first of the nodes. So that gives us the start of our point-to-point pattern. I'm going to pull her up here, and so I can hit View All. I'm going to delete these remaining pieces, and I'm also going to delete my repeat patterns mark so I can actually hit View All. Now I'm going to rotate this pattern so that she's reasonably straight. And one of the aspects of a point-to-point pattern is that the start and the end have to be on the same vertical plane. To accomplish this, I'm going to switch over to the endpoint anchor, and then I'm just going to click G on the keyboard for a grid point snap. I'm going to snap the butterfly into place. The next thing we want to check for is to make sure that the pattern is going left to right. And in this case it's not. We can see the word start over here and we can see the word end here. We could also check that by clicking Set Sew Order by clicking F8 on the keyboard. And you can see that the pattern's starting here and ending here. To fix this, we just right-click the pattern and we say Reverse Start End. You can see the word start's now over here, the word end is here. We can confirm this by pressing Set Sew Order, F8, and we have 0 and an arrow ending here. Now that we have our point-to-point pattern, we want to be able to use this on another quilt group and even in another project. To do this, just right-click, pick Export to CSQ. We'll name it. And it shows up at the top of your project. To prove to you that this is a pattern, I'll go into Add Patterns. There's a new pattern type called CSQ. And here we can see the butterfly demo. Now we'll want to test our butterfly. I'm going to make another quilt group. I'm going to use repeat patterns. Sizing doesn't really matter for this. And we're just going to put it on there. And there we go. We have a continuous pattern that can be used as a point-to-point. I can even use it with the new drawing tool. I'm going to turn my freeze aspect on. I'm going to press and hold Alt and press P. And turn the grid point off for now. And there's our new pattern. Upon reviewing the fit of this pattern, there's a couple of things I don't like. I don't like this amount of space between these butterflies. I want them to be closer, and I don't really like this point. So I'm going to show you guys how to fix that. So we'll go back to the original pattern that we split out of the large pano, and we're going to divide this pattern here. This piece we're going to move out of the way, and now we're going to add an arc by pressing and holding Alt and then A. We're going to click E for endpoint snap. I'm going to press E again to turn the endpoint snap off. Now I'm trying to get a curve like what I want. And then I'm going to add a little curve right here so that the sewing is fluid. I'm going to press E again for endpoint snap. Click. Turn the endpoint snap off. I want it to be right about here. Something like that maybe. Okay. Now this pattern is now not a point-to-point pattern, but we can fix it easy enough. First thing I like to do though is set the sew order. And we've got problems. We've got this piece over here sewing, which we can just delete. I'm clicking F8 for sew order. The butterfly sews first, and then it comes over and sews this arc and this arc. It's very important that you check direction and sew order when you're doing work like this. So I want this piece to go first, then this one. I messed up. I'm going to press Escape. Try again. I want this one to go first, then this one, then this one. 0, 1, 2. But I noticed that the direction's wrong on this piece and this piece, which will cause jump stitches. So I'm going to click F8 to commit my sew order changes. Then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to reverse the start and end on this arc and this arc. And now I'm going to press F8 again to check. And I've got 0 arrows coming this way, 1 arrows going here, 2 butterfly arrow ends here. Now we'll want to group our patterns. It's very important that you pick the patterns and group them in the order in which you want them to sew. I'm going to switch over by double clicking to our endpoint anchor. We're going to turn on grid snap. We're going to snap our butterfly to the grid. Now we're going to right click our pattern and say export to CSQ. And we'll call this number 2. We'll make another test group. And you can see our new patterns here in our project. It's also in the patterns directory that I've been working on. I'm going to set our number of repeats. Click OK. And there we go. I like this a little bit better. So here's our original attempt, and here's our second attempt. It's wise to try sewing a pattern on muslin before you do it on a quilt, just to make sure there's not jump stitches. If you do find there's jump stitches, you can always go back to the original. And as long as you haven't combined group, you've still got all these as individual pieces, and you can reverse the individual piece orders, the individual arcs order, and set the sew order of them properly. You can even use CSQs to make new patterns. In this case, I want to make a corner for my border. So I'm going to select these last two. I'm going to rubber stamp them. I'm going to rotate one of them 90 degrees. And I'm going to pull this around over to here. I'm going to grid point snap the ends to keep everything square. I decided to change my grid size here to 3 inches and then re-snapped the 2 sides to this grid. To help me visualize, I'm going to press Alt-B and I'm going to start drawing a boundary. Now, I have grid point snap active. And we can easily envision the upper corner of a quilt this way. Pressing Escape to end the boundary selection. You can use a CSQ pattern to make another pattern. I'm going to rubber stamp it. And this is my copy. Be better to switch to edge mode to get it in position. And going to place my pattern, my corner. Well, it'd be better if the butterfly was more up in the corner. Be kind of like that. Okay. For the next part, I'm going to divide the pattern to make the hookups different. And it takes some experience to be able to do this. I'm going to click Divide Pattern. I'm going to divide the pattern right here. And I'll divide the pattern again at that same point. Now I have a pattern that's just the ending arc. So now I'll come up here and change my pattern anchor type to endpoint. I'm going to turn off the grid point snap, and I can pull my arc around like this. Now we wouldn't want the arc to be going down past our boundary, so we're going to switch to edge. We're going to compress the arc. We'll go back to the endpoint type. And we need to endpoint snap in this case, like that. Okay, and that's not too bad of a hookup. I've decided for the lead-in arc that I'm just going to delete this entire segment. And now I'm going to draw a new arc. Actually, I'm going to try doing the curve tool. Pressing and holding Alt, and then I'm pressing C. I'm starting off with an endpoint snap, then I'm turning that off. Kind of want something that comes up like this. I want it to kind of come over here like that. This straight line going up will smooth out as soon as I endpoint snap in. It's not too bad. Maybe could have done better on this roughness right here. I'll delete this and try again. I'm pressing and holding Alt and clicking C. I'm drawing a curve here. Usually less points are better. And right click to end, escape to exit the function. And that's not too bad. So we now have our corner piece. We need to pick it in the order that we want it to sew. Switch over. I'm going to pull it out. I'm doing that so I can more easily see the sew order. I'm going to press F8. And we can see that our sew order is a little bit confusing on this pattern. 5 and 6 are the original pieces. When you divide a pattern, it maintains its order. So we'll want those two to be last, 5 then 6. We want this one to be first. And that's the start of the pattern. It comes around here, goes into 5, which is the butterfly, and then 6 to end. And to click that 6 a couple of times. And then F8 to commit this sew order. And now we'll pick our patterns again by holding Control, picking them in the order we want them to sew, and we'll say Export to CSQ, and we'll add the word corner, and there's our corner. I'm now going to create a border corner so I can test my little butterfly here. And I'm going to show you a little trick I use a lot when I'm testing things. I'm not actually going to be clicking the upper left hand corner on the quilt. I'm going to be using the new boundary tool. I'm pressing and holding Alt, the Alt key, and then I'm pressing B. Grid point snap is on. And we're just going to snap around here, right click to close, and then we're going to do the inside. So if you're teaching a class or you want to try things out, you can do this without actually getting up and going to the quilt. And then all you do is just hit stop to this little box down here, and you can hit escape to end the boundary tool. It asks what our corner orientation is. It's upper left. And we'll try L-shaped. I think that'll work well. And then we're going to hit pattern to boundary. And there we have our little butterfly in the corners. Offline, I'm going to go ahead and fill these repeats in on the sides and on the top. Okay, I've used repeat patterns to fill the top here, and then I used rubber stamp to move 2 of the butterflies down here to the left, and rotate them, and then rotate them again to finish off here. The margins aren't quite as good as I would like to have seen. That's probably mostly a factor of how I designed the corner. So for time's sake, I could have gone back and redesigned the corner slightly to make a better fitting margin with the border, but for our case, I think this will show our example well on how you can make a border piece and a corner piece. We can use the set sew order to make this all sew continuously. In the past, it would have sewn the corners, and then the top, and then the left, and then the right, which is not only time consuming, but leaves lots of knots. In order to do this, we just press F8, and we start clicking the patterns in the order we want to sew them. Since these are rubber stamped, this is one pattern. It really helps. You see how that blue arrow turned, the arrow turned blue when I clicked it? It really helped me to know what was going on with this next pattern, which is the pink element. And then we've got another rubber stamp group here. We'll just keep going along, clicking these. You're beginning to maybe understand why we set the color the way we did. And now we just press F8 to commit our changes. And we have a continuous sewing border corner. Here I have an edge to edge made with the butterfly we pulled out of the pano. I think this would look better alternated. And maybe a little bit of positive vertical spacing would help. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Now in the beta, we were trying to figure out a way to use sew order to change the direction of this. Right now we're not allowing you to set sew order on an edge to edge. I just pressed F8 and this is the message you get. Cannot set sewing order for an edge to edge quilt group. But there is a way around this. What we did in the beta is we picked every pattern and then we exported this to a CSQ. Saved it. And it's on the screen here. Now, this edge to edge here, we only did this to get these two rows. There's really no other purpose to this edge to edge, so we're going to abandon this quilt group. We're going to add another one to do our edge to edge development. And these techniques that I'm showing you are advanced. They are possible with the new version. So now I've got one pattern and I'm going to divide it. Endpoint here. It didn't divide where I was expecting, so I hit Control Z a couple of times to get it back together. I'm going to try again. Try dividing it here on the end. Okay, there we go. Now we split the rows into two pieces. But the direction of the pattern of the rows is left to right and left to right. What we want is the top row to go left to right and the second row to go right to left, so it's continuous. All we're going to do is we're going to right click the second row and we're going to say reverse start and end. And then we're going to group all and we're going to export to CSQ. We'll call this edge to edge butterfly final. And now I'm going to build a edge to edge to test this. Okay, I've got the edge to edge just about done. I just entered the height. And here we have the edge to edge sewing continuously with the start here and an end here. To make this into an alternating, we could just group all this. Pull these pieces out like so. If we'd wanted this to sew off the edges, we could have put a connecting line when we had it split over here. We could still do that. Just set the sew order. But in this case, what I was planning on doing, I'll pull this over even more because of the void. This there, and this one I think would be better in a little bit, like so. And then you can add a trim by clicking Alt-T with the grid point snap on. It makes it pretty easy. And so here I'm drawing my trims. If you have the new stop at jump stitch turned off, unchecked, then this would sew continuously and just drag thread on these jump stitches. So it's a good time saver. and a good use of the new CSQ and the reverse pattern, set so order. Have fun with these new features. They're going to increase your productivity and, more importantly, your creativity. Thank you for taking the time to watch this demonstration.